Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today, and virtual audience, thank you very much for joining us. And I remind you that the great thing about doing this for a virtual audience is you can watch it at any time, not necessarily while it's live. However, you don't get to ask questions. Too bad, right? So I'm really pleased. Megan and I have done, I can't even remember how many events together, and this is the very first time that we've done it together live, because they have been Zoom events. And one of the really lovely qualities about Megan is that she's a great host for other authors. You are so supportive of other authors.
It's so fun for me to do.
Yeah, but you're also really good at it, and then, you know, just being fun isn't necessarily enough. But anyway, we've done all kinds of events together, but this is the first time we've had a chance to be in person. So we went out and had a drink or two. She had less than I did, so that's another reason why I'm handing this off to John. Right. But I think, you know, it's fun. This is the first time you've been to Scottsdale when it wasn't like 120,
yes,
right?
Yes, this is a much cooler temperature than I'm used to when I visit, yes.
Because it was July.
Yep, the last one was July.
And the good news is that Megan's publishing schedule may have changed to April. So she gets the chance. I mean, isn't it beautiful out right now? I just noticed coming in, I was pointing out to her, look, there's the jacaranda tree, and look over there, the palo verde, you're just coming into bloom. All the little hedgehogs are coming. I have one of my own at home, a little orange hedgehog, and I go out and photograph it every day because I love it. And the weird, what is it, the night blooming Sirius cactus? We got one bloom in the garden yesterday, and we all turned out, you know. So it only lasts, right, for a little bit. Hi, thanks for coming. There are plenty of chairs over there, and there's delicious food in the back. You're welcome to help yourselves. Right. So, Megan, here we are talking about The Only Survivors, which is possibly your most knockout cover.
It is beautiful. I wish I could take credit for it, but I have a wonderful cover designer who has done all the covers since All the Missing Girls, and a great team at Scribner who really thought about what they wanted the focus of this to be, and I love that it looks like it could either be a sunset or a storm coming. Like, it kind of walks that line, like, is it ominous, is it beautiful, a setting can be both, and I love that that is like front and center on this cover.
It really is lovely. And in fact, landscape has always been a major part of your books. And when I talked to you, we had toured around various locations. You did, I'm trying to remember, I think it's you that did the one with the Agatha Christie kind of houses around the lake.
Yes, so Such a Quiet Place was like a lakeside community where it's sort of like all the houses on one street, like a locked room neighborhood. Yep.
It was. I mean, and so basically, how many of you read that book? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So the point is that the murder suspects, assuming there is a murder in that environment, are largely contained within that.
Yes.
It's not likely some complete stranger walked into that kind of, and that's an old Agatha Christie construct, the country house murder, you know, where the aging owner of the castle decides to invite all his relatives to dinner so he can tell them that he's changing his will because he's going to marry a 22-year-old blonde, and then amazingly he's murdered. And that actually is the plot of Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which has been remade. But you know, so it's almost like it's not suicide by cop, but sort of suicide by relatives. And actually, it's often confused. I will just say that locker room mystery is not that particular thing. A locker room mystery is an impossible crime. And the whole thrust of a locker room mystery is how did it happen? Not who did it or not why did it. It's like, how was the crime? Or I'm saving you from here. But it really is true. And John Dixon Carr was a golden age writer who wrote Madison's whole thing. And they're really hard to write because you can't do it if you haven't worked out how it all happened before you start to write the book. Yep. So you have to
do all the plotting first.
You do?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it'd be hard. So what do you think, if we were going to call this book anything, what would you call it?
Yeah, well, I guess I won't say it's locked room, but there is a small cast in a house, and I am very drawn to that sort of like all the suspects in one place, where suspicion falls on everyone. Anyone has had it's almost not like an impossible murder, it's almost the opposite, like anyone could have done it. which is the one who did it.
It's a really classic golden age structure, and it's held up. I mean, it could be a cabin on a ship, it could be a theater, it could be a castle, or
Right.
a house, it could be a space station. The point is that there's only so many people
Right.
that are involved, right? Otherwise, trying to solve the crime would be almost impossible.
Right? Yes. Yes.
All right, so in this particular, you also like two time structures. So if you have something going on in the present, it almost always arises from events in the past. And you like pulling people together in the present that met in the past when something unfortunate happened.
I do. And I do that like definitely. And what my editor, I always say the theme of my books is very much like the past returns. And this is very front and center in this story. So in this book, when these people were 18, they were former classmates who were the only survivors of a tragic accident that happened their senior year of high school. At the end, only 9 of them survived, and they decided to make a pact that every year they're going to get together around the week of this anniversary in order to check in on one another, keep one another safe, or so they say. And the book starts 10 years later as the 10-year anniversary is about to happen. Now they're down to 7 members, and another has just gone missing on day 1. So it does tell the story both past and present. So it's told 7 days in the present going forward and 7 hours in the past from the characters, each character's perspective of that accident.
So, by 10 years, does it round numbers, do they have more resonance than if you made it like the 11th or the 9th year?
Yeah, I think for me, I start thinking about like when other people also get interested in things. And, there's a lot of news that happens that comes up again around, the 10-year anniversary of something or the 20-year anniversary. And so it made sense to me that this group of people also that had something happen to them that was kind of a secret. They didn't really speak of it to anyone. It was such a tragedy. People start kind of poking around again at this like 10-year anniversary. Or is it somebody from the inside who's like, I have a story to tell and take advantage of this 10-year time frame. But I'm really also interested in that time of life where it's not so long in the past. These people are still getting together every year. They were not friends, but this one thing had bound them together. And so I feel like 10 years, even the main character, Cassie at the start of this book is like, I'm out. 10 years is long enough. Like, I am not going to this. And then she sees an obituary from another survivor who had recently died and decides, no, I have to go. But I do feel like after 10 years, there might not be such a strong pull that they've all decided, yes, we're still going to come. So 10 years seems like a good number to me.
It does seem a good number, but at the same time, as you point out, not everyone has survived the 10-year mark. So is that just natural attrition, or is there some other reason why some people have not made it to the 10-year mark? So, this book raises, it's really entertaining, as all of Megan's books are, and suspenseful. But there are some really deep questions involved in this book. And, what it comes down to is if you were in a life and death situation, what would you do? Who would you choose to save, if anybody? Would it be somebody that was with you? Would it be you yourself? And then, depending on what choice you made, how would you live with it? I think this is a brilliant book club discussion book. I mean, it really is very dramatic and very powerful. So, how did you feel when you read it? When you're giving these people these roles and these questions. Dan, you have a real impact on you as a person, not just an author?
Yeah, it did because, you're putting these characters in an impossible situation and you're trying to figure out what each of these characters would do, and everyone has kind of their own response and their own reaction to it, and I think it's only natural that you try to imagine yourself in a situation like that. The truth is, like, every single person was changed very dramatically from this. And when I started writing the book, that's what I was most interested in, other than this idea of the reunion, was this idea of how 9 people that have the same life-changing event happen to them, and yet have completely different life responses from that. Some of them really stay grounded to where this happened and have not moved past it. some have changed their lives dramatically in a way that, like, you know, in the past, in high school they were probably not someone you'd be like, that's the most likely to succeed person, and yet has become super successful. And so what is it about those choices that these characters made and the things that have lived with them, whether it's guilt or not, that have allowed them or created these new versions of who they become? And thinking about that was what gave rise to the structure, because I wanted to show who they were in the past and then who they were in the present now. And so I wanted to give a voice to each of those characters. And so each hour is narrated by each of the survivors. And you kind of see who they were, what their fears were, and the choices they made as well. And it kind of contrasts to who they are in the present now.
So it's an interesting narrative, you know, if you have multiple voices, it's not just one point of view telling you the story, but, you know, and your opinion of who they each are varies as the next person speaks up, right? Because you heard from one, and then maybe that person's version of the truth is not the one that the next person. I don't know if any of you ever read Lawrence Durrell, a book called, he got a series, there were 4. It's called The Alexandria Quartet. Yes, there are more. And it starts with an incident, and each book tells what happened or relates that from a different group of characters. And so you think you know the truth when you finish the first book in the Alexandria Quartet, and when you get all the way around to book 4, you recognize that the reality of it was entirely different. So it does all depend on perspective.
That's something I'm fascinated by, the way that, you know, you have your version of events, and even if you didn't see every part of it, your mind sort of fills in those gaps and creates a story. But if somebody else sees something different or sees one other piece of evidence, how does that change the entire trajectory of their version of the truth? And is there one true version of the truth, or is it all just, you know, from your own perspective?
Well, part of it is that all of us want to be the hero of our own story, right? We're seeing that play out every single day if you watch the news, that everybody wants to be, no, I'm serious, you know, wants to be the hero of their own story. And, you know, part of what's going on in the world today is how many people you can get to buy into your version of your being the hero in your story. Some people are more successful than others, and then things can change, and you can sort of watch it all going on right in front of you. How are we all going to feel about Justice Thomas next week? As things keep, no, I'm serious. You know, stuff keeps coming out, and so every day there's kind of a new version of what's going on. And so in a way, it's kind of like peeling an onion, right, to get to a court. So do you have to think of those characters how they were when the incident happened, and then peel it away yourself in order for this story to progress?
Yeah, I did. The character part was my favorite part, to kind of really dive into who they were, but I do not start with like a character sketch, really. No, I start, and like the first scene of this book is the first thing that I wrote, and you know, all the characters come together in this house for the first time. They all have different personalities and ways of talking to one another and about the event. And I kind of backed my way from that into who they were as the past, and kind of took a step back one at a time. But for the most part, I started in the present and then thought about what would have made them this way, and then created who they were in the past.
So because you're such a savvy and skilled author, you don't actually tell us what happened. It's not like you start out. So, you know, how do you decide how much of the past to reveal? Because you have to, pacing is a huge part of a thriller, and this is basically a, you know, it's not a MI5 spy thriller or military fiction thriller. It's more of a, I don't know what you want to call it, suspense thriller, I guess. But how, you know, as an author, as you're moving along, how do you decide how to pace it? How much do you reveal as you go along? So the reader is constantly going, but what happened, you know, or what if?
Well, the truth is that when I start, I only see kind of the big picture at start. Yeah, so I write my way into stories, and I do a lot of my work is in the revision process because of that. Because you're kind of, I see the first part of the book is like, what are my puzzle pieces? So when I start and I talk about this accident in the past, I'm telling the truth in a very broad overview way of this is an accident that happened. when their vans, they were going on a service trip, and their vans went off the road in the mountains of Tennessee during a storm, and they ended up in a ravine with a raging river, and it took them 7 hours to reach safety. Those are all true things. It's the story that was told, that they told, and the story that was reported. And then from there, you kind of dig in a little more, but what happened down there for 7 hours, and why, and how, and who survived, and why? And that becomes part of my process of writing, is kind of unwinding those mysteries. I think I'm really interested in not just the mystery in the present, and there is a very big mystery in the present, but also like the mysteries inside every person, and kind of unwinding them at the same time.
And you do unwind it, you don't unwind it in the full.
Right.
So you do have to read it all the way through. Now, I can tell you as a person who used to actually live in this part of the country, that if the driving is truly treacherous, the mountain roads are horrendous. They're often 2 lanes. There are coal trucks and logging trucks that are, have any of you ever driven down Highway 1 through Oregon, for example? The logging trucks are, like terrifying. But it's the same thing. And so it is a high accident rate to be first place. Right. So that part she didn't make up.
Right.
You didn't actually try that, did you? Did you go out and do it?
So I did. Well, I didn't do that, but I did. I tried to do visits to every place that I write about, even though I do make up the places. But so I did a research trip out to the Outer Banks, and then I was driving with my teenage daughter. We had to drive to Nashville, and so we took that same route that the characters are taking on their trip. And I did not go onto the mountain roads for the most part, although we had one of those weird life imitating the fiction I was writing because there was so much traffic, and my daughter was trying to veer me off the road. She's like, no, it says it's only a 20-minute delay, or we could, and I was like looking at the map, and you see the wiggly lines, like, no, we're going to be up in the mountain, and I just wrote this traffic accident, they're sitting in the traffic, just going to wait it out. But yes.
And another complicating factor is there's a huge possibility of flaw.
Yes.
I used to commute when I was a librarian at the Library of Congress, but I had family in Southwest Virginia. I used to commute from Washington on weekends to do that. And to do it, you had to drive over the big mountains in Charlottesville, and they actually have fog sensors and fog horns built into the highway because the fog chances are so terrible. And, I mean, literally,
drive
you
with your
can't.
flashers on.
Well, at some point, you literally can't see at all. And sometimes you stop. So, it is a tricky part of the country.
It is.
To write. All right, so Outer Banks, where is that where the reunion is taking place?
Yeah, so this cover is the house that they meet at every year. They call the house the Shallows, and I write about settings that I love, and then apparently, like my husband says, my brand is like taking places we love and turning them creepy now. Like that's we love
family
I know,
vacations.
ruining vacations. Yes, I ruined hiking last year. This year is the beach. But I love this idea of a place that has this dual nature. Like it can be the most beautiful place. This is a place of safety for them. It's far from the site of the accident. If you've not been to the Outer Banks, you have to take a series of bridges to get to these islands. It has the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Sound on the other. So, you're seeing sunrise and sunset. It's gorgeous. They're protected and surrounded on all sides by the Invisible team, is what they say. No one can get to them there. It's just them. Great. And then, when something turns creepy, it's also a place where, this can be a trap. When we took our research trip out there, right after we left, there was a headline, and it said, 2 houses swept out to sea in the Outer Banks. And I live in North Carolina, so we get the local news. And there wasn't even a storm. It was like a low-pressure system that was just sitting off the coast, and it was causing the tides to just rise. And then they had to close the highway, which is really just this 2-lane road with dunes on both sides, because at high tide, the waters were coming up. And, it becomes a trap. There's no way on or off. And so that actually impacted what I was writing in this book, because now there's a storm coming. And, now someone's missing, and there's a storm coming, but it's a setting that kind of has that duality. It's beautiful, and it's a place of safety, but it's also a place where nature is it can be very dangerous. You do not want to be out there, in a hurricane. So it kind of has both those elements where you can feel isolated in a good way and in a bad way, and also exposed.
Actually, the Outer Banks in Florida they disappear before too much longer because the water keeps rising. I know. Every once in a while I root for thunder. Right. But I mean, we can't really ignore the effect of the rising oceans and the outer bays. Unfortunately, this is something really beautiful. How many of you ever read like Misty Chicotin when you were young? Did you read any of those wonderful like Black Beauty and that's because I'm old, but we used to read horse stories.
Yes.
Black Beauty was a great one. But Misty Chicotin, there's like a wild horse thing on loose on the outer islands, and they take them out there and habitat just disappearing, and then what happens to them? But we're in danger. So one of the things about your books that's good news for any of you who haven't read Megan before is that they each stand alone. So you don't have to read any of other Megan's books to read, survivors. Why did you decide that you wanted to write individual novels instead of a series?
I feel like I naturally gravitate that way, and it was less an active decision, but I think, because I love to read series, but I think because I gravitate towards characters who are not in like a investigative role as a natural part of their jobs or livelihoods. So, I don't write about a detective necessarily, or, somebody who would be investigating a series of crimes. I like to focus on a character who finds themselves in the middle of a situation and kind of has to, use their own resources and try to figure out like what's going on and how to get to safety. But the other reason is because I think I've talked about this before. I love characters before plot is how I see a book, and so I see a character arc and all these things they have to get through. And I know I write these like dark, creepy books, but I'm thinking about like a character journey that they make it to the other side of these things, hopefully. And so to put these characters back in a book, and I think about them sometimes years later, like, well, there might be like some things that happen that could give rise to another idea, but I feel like you have to ruin their lives again to put them in another. I write thrillers, like terrible things have to happen to these people again. It's not like they're investigating something in their community or have a role that would lead to a lot of crimes happening around them, hopefully. So I'll never say never, but I really gravitate towards the standalone. I love creating a new setting every time too, because I love setting like character, and so that for me is part of the joy of creating the stories, is discovering the setting and who the characters are, and why they find themselves in this predicament.
Well, I mean, that is the problem with series, in that things happen to them, and the series writer has to decide whether that's going to impact the character in the next book, or whether, John D. McDonald, Travis McGee was like born whole every single book. It never mattered what terrible thing happened to him. He was just like right there, ready to go, completely, injury-free, new woman, all of it. It's sort of like Reacher, I mean, that's the joy of Reacher in a way, is that he's entirely whole every book, and it's just started to adventure. So a long-term series writer, usually, today anyway, has to account for whatever happened in earlier books that will have changed, damaged, or otherwise impacted the character or people in that character's life. Did the girlfriend die? Did the dog? It's not the dog almost never dies. But people die. Yeah. And so you don't have to deal with that.
Right.
What you're doing, you can
create from scratch.
Yep.
And I also, I change a lot of things as I write, and I think I would feel very bound by, the book before, because I would write that not thinking about the books to come, because that's kind of the way, my process, and so, I would be bound by, a plot that I cannot change because it's been published. But when I revise, I change things pretty dramatically sometimes.
Yes, well, I think I used up my allotted 25 minutes. So I'm going to pass this on. No, I'm going to stay. Pass this on to John, who is going to have his own questions. But John, when we get to the end, I have a book to give away, an advanced reading copy of a book that we published by Annie Hogsett called The Devil's Own Game. You can decide, maybe the person who came the farthest or whatever you want to do. I'm sure that Jim will have again, and we'll see how we do here. So ungraceful. There's no good way. There is no good way. There we go. All right. And we'll just move to the back. Here we go.
is one of the few authors Barbara and I fight over.
And both of us won.
If I understand correctly, or the only survivors came from a trip you took with your husband.
Yes. Another time of like, I'm going to tell you the lovely vacation story that then inspired this tragic story that I wrote about. So 2 summers ago, we were in Puerto Rico, which is where my husband's family is from. We were visiting his family, and we brought some friends with us because they had never seen the area and they wanted. We were like, well, come with us. We'll show you around. So we rented a van together, and it accidentally ended up being like a tour vehicle, like a huge tour vehicle. And so my husband put his phone in the cup holder, closed the door, and it like shattered. Like there's a line underneath that was like no phones here, but we did not see that until after the phone shattered. So then things got weird. They were walking the next day, my husband and teenage daughter, along the beach. They see something in the surf, reaches down, and it's his phone. Like he lost a phone, and the next day a phone washes up at his feet. And it was dead. It was in like one of those cases that it was cracked. There was water and sand in it. They brought it back to the condo, and they were like, well, let's just see what happens. And immediately I was like, this is a horrible idea. Have you seen no crime fiction? Have you read no crime fiction? This is obviously evidence of a crime that we had just picked up and brought back to our condo. And then they were like, well, let's just see what happens. They left it out in the sun. My daughter, we came back at the end of the day, and she's like, oh, I brought that phone in, I plugged it in, and it works, and there's no passcode screen. I'm like, that's like so many phone calls happened. Now we turned on the phone, so whoever was involved in this criminal activity can track us down. And at this point, my teenagers are like, why do you think that way? Like, this is not a normal way that I feel like I'm not the only one, though. And so, yeah, thank you. Found my people. So, they like couldn't get the apps to work. The phone kept having like that green screen of death every time they would try to open something. But there was one thing they found, and it was the last photo taken, and it was on a jet ski looking out at the water, and I'm like, so now we have a crime scene. Like this is all just happening, like exactly how I would envision this unfolding on like a horrible television series about like everyone making the wrong decision because they've never seen a horror movie. And they found like an emergency contact number, and they were like, well, we can't use this phone, but we'll call it from our own phone. They did, and they actually, it was not evidence of a crime, I was wrong. But the people who owned it, like they had been lost 2 weeks earlier while on a jet ski while they were on vacation. It somehow survived and washed up in the surf at our feet with no passcode screen. And all I could think about was this other story, like the what ifs. And I got home and I was like, well, obviously I have to write this. And I was like, okay, well, who's going to be at the beach? Who's there? Why? How are like the people who lost and found this phone book connected? And I was like, well, friends would be too nice and family would be too fun. I know it's a reunion that no one wants to be at. Like that's why I backed into this idea of the only survivors. And if you read the book, there's a scene that sounds eerily similar to what I just described. The main character, Cassidy, is walking along the beach, not wanting to be at this house that she just arrived at, and a phone washes up at her feet. It's dead. She brings it back, can't turn it on, but she's able to bring it back to life. It has no passcode screen. It keeps dying. It only works when it's plugged in. It takes a totally different turn from here. But when I started writing this, I sent a note to my editor because I was like, you're going to read this and you're going to be like, the phone washes up at your feet, there's no passcode screen, really? And I'm like, these are the only true parts of the book. Life is stranger than fiction. Yes.
You talked a little bit about setting the importance as an author. If I remember correctly, it's in water.
Yes, you do remember it. It's
Why?
memory.
Why water?
I feel like for me, again, this is me turning places I love to read, but like there's so much beauty and peace in these places, but there's so much power and potential in them as well. Like they are nature they're gonna do like things happen in the mountains and the woods. Like nature is an element and a character in itself. And same as the beach. I mean, a storm is a powerful thing. The ocean is a powerful thing. And all of these things that are beautiful can also be terrifying. I mean, if you're lost in the mountains, it's absolutely terrifying. And, you know, the ocean can be terrifying as well, for sure. And these are also characters who had a really traumatic experience in a river and are now staying right beside the water. And some characters will not touch the water at all for that reason.
So does that mean nice looking mountains?
It is a lake in a mountain setting. Changing it up and doing both.
Let's talk about your origins as a writer, because you're actually a scientist.
Yes.
John, we can't hear you. Can't hear you.
I'll try to talk louder, but I used to work in the library. I don't want to project so far, but just stealing books. But how do you reconcile the scientific side with the side?
So yeah, I went to school for biology, and I love science, and I feel like they seem a lot different than they are, like the, you know, writing, but also the science, and I feel like they're actually much more connected and one kind of leads the other. I think for me what drew me to science was the mysteries and things you're trying to understand, and I would say pretty much the same thing as what draws me to writing is like trying to understand the mystery inside these characters. And I do approach, I do not do a lot of upfront outlining, but I keep this Excel spreadsheet as I'm going. And I use Excel spreadsheets to help me with the structure and to like, as I'm writing, I fill in clues or, you know, reveals or things that you learn. So it's not really about plot, it's about like elements within the story that might give rise to things later on or not. And if they don't, I go back and kind of delete them. But it becomes a puzzle that I'm working on as I'm writing. And so I feel like there is an element of how you might approach an experiment that is involved in the creative process. And they don't feel that different to me. It's just, you know, making things up instead of, you know, going with, yes.
You got your start as a YA writer.
He did.
You have adult. This is possible. It's made them a YA writer.
Well, I think they're the same. I think the only thing that's different in my YA than in my adult, I don't even think the content is that different, honestly. It really is about the main character and who a story is suited for, and the perspective that I tell the story through. And so when I think of a story idea, it's like, what is this suited for? Is it suited for a character who's figuring things out for the first time and their place in the world? Or is this best suited for a character who has these decades of lived experiences that are like changing the way they perceive events? And I also think that the things I loved about writing YA, I feel like I'm able to incorporate them in a lot of my books, because a lot of my books are about how the past influences the present. And in this book, you see them. You see them as teenagers. They're shorter sections, but you see them when they're 17 or 18 years old in the flashbacks. And there's other books where we see flashbacks from when they were younger. All the Missing Girls, you see a lot from what happened when they were 18, and yes, now the book is 10 years later, but you see those things, and it's very much a part of them. So I think that even though I'm mostly focused on adult stories right now, I've incorporated some of those elements and, you know, the things that drew me to YA into these books as well.
What about Megan the Reader?
Oh.
You actually got your start with your mother's books.
Yes. So my mother, I feel like so many writers are like, we're so lucky because our parents were readers, and that's definitely the case with me. My mom is a huge mystery reader, and we still share all of our books. But we had bookshelves of, you know, mysteries growing up. She had off on Thursdays, would take me to the library and just let me loose. And I feel like that's how I found the things that spoke to me. And I was drawn very early to the mysteries. Nancy Drew, I feel like a lot of mystery readers get their start there. And then middle school, I had this like, started Nancy Drew, ended with Edgar Allan Poe. Like there was just something about like the dark stories that was really intriguing to me, and like these mysteries, not just on the surface, but inside, like people's morality. And so I've just always been drawn to that type of story. I read pretty broadly, but those are my go-to, is suspense. I love character-driven, which there's just so much great character-driven suspense right now, too.
What social media platforms are you on?
So I'm on Instagram more than I should be on Instagram, but I'm definitely there on Megan L. Miranda. That's probably where I interact the most. I also have an author Facebook page and Twitter, but like Instagram is where I'm always like, oh, hello, what's going on? How's it going?
Should we take some questions?
Yes, I would love to. Yeah.
I know this would be hard, but if you can,
Okay.
what would be your favorite book you've written?
Oh, that is so hard. Okay, so I usually always say, and it's true, that it's the book that I just finished because it's so fresh in your mind, and I've just spent a year in these characters' heads, and I feel like I'm not far removed from that story at all, and it feels very much alive, and there's such like an excitement about finishing the book and getting it to where you want to be, and so this right now is my favorite. But when you talk about like books you've written, I also think about writing process, and so there's a book that sticks with me for a very long time because I thought about it for a very long time before I wrote it, and that was All the Missing Girls, which was my first book for adults. It was like my second book idea that I thought of, and it was my 6th published novel. So I just spent so long thinking about it, trying it, wasn't quite working, came back to it, and nobody knew I was working on it, really. Like, it wasn't something under contract, it was my passion project. And when, like, I remember the moment I finished the very first draft and actually reached the end, and I was, like, alone on the sofa in my living room with my laptop in my lap. And it, to this day, is, like, one of my career highlights, I think, is just that moment of, like, I got this story out onto the page. So because of that, I feel very, like, attached to that book, in addition to all my others. But I love them equally.
Well, that's one of my favorites too, so it's nice
Okay.
to come through in the writing.
Thank you. That makes me very happy.
Other questions?
So, when you write your characters, do you figure out ahead of time, like you might need a character that's, say, obsessive compulsive, or you need a character that's an adulterer, or somebody that's failed high school, or how do you figure out what characteristics your characters are going to have?
That's a great question, and I wish I had like a simpler answer to that, because I don't think about it at the start. I really like this idea of, you know, who is in this room and how do they interact, and kind of backing out of it from there. And so I discover the character traits as I'm writing, honestly. And then I think about, you know, if a character is a little sarcastic or this one's a little closed off, like, why? Why are they this way? And that kind of gives rise to, you know, other traits. There are, especially with a book like this, where there's a large cast and they are introduced fairly early, that I did think a little bit more about distinct elements to each of these characters that would set them apart and make them easy to, you know, remember. And so for me, that didn't come from necessarily a trait, but the job they chose to do after, you know, this event that happened in their past. And, you know, Grace is a trauma therapist. Yeah, she's a counselor, and she speaks like she's a trauma therapist. Like, she's always kind of trying to ease the tension, and she moves with the way of grace. And so, and then, you know, Brody is an EMT, and, you know, so I try to, like, give everybody characteristics like that, and then think about why they would have gone that route, and kind of give them those traits that help them become more memorable.
So you make it up as you go
I
along.
do.
Okay.
Yes.
That sounds really hard.
Like, it's kind of like like, that's the joy too. Like, I think sometimes if I did plot everything out, the thing that brings me to the page and is trying to, like, I wonder what's going to happen, and I want to figure it out, and that's what brings me to, like, the draft every day. And then the work is when I do figure it out and have to make it all work. Yes.
So when you were writing YA, you didn't have teenagers, but now,
Right.
like how, and then you know you did approach, you know, that age group in this book. Like, has that changed at all? Just your perspective, just as a parent now.
Yes, because when I was writing YA, I was thinking about, like, when I was 16 or so, and I have a 15 and a 17-year-old right now, and it's definitely something, it became more terrifying when I was writing this story about teenagers than when I was writing it thinking about, because when they were younger, we never write about that age. And now as they've gotten older, it's sort of like, well, I'm not going to write about that age, and now I'm like, oh, I am, because that's what I'm really interested in, is like what happens at this stage of your life that kind of makes you become the people that you are. So yes, it gave me a very different perspective. They are nothing like the characters in the books, but like it is like I was writing The Last to Vanish, which is about people going missing in the wilderness, and my daughter was about to go on like an outward bound trip, and I was like, like there's just too much. I mean, it got canceled, but there's just a lot more of like, oh, we're driving this road, and she drives, and it's just, you think so much more, and I think it's given me a different perspective that I'm able to go maybe even a little deeper into it because seeing it from that parent perspective too.
I'm 15, 17, and 18.
Oh yeah, same place.
That's why I was like, that's what I want to ask.
Yes. Yeah.
Your imagination is yours.
Yes, it is. It is.
It sounds like All the Missing Girls was kind of an outlier in terms of like writing timeline. How long does it typically take you to crack out your first draft, and then how long does it take you to revise the first draft?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the interesting thing though about All the Missing Girls is that when I actually figured out how to tell the story, it took me the same amount of time as it took most of my books. It was like figuring out the right way to do the structure, and then everything took me about 9 months to get a first draft where I feel like it's ready to go to my editor. That does not mean that that is the right version of that book. So ideally, that's the book that then we're like, okay, the story's here, the structure's here, the characters are here, let's work with what we have. Structure for me is the big hurdle. Like if I love structure, and I think about why stories are told a certain way, why a character is telling a story a certain way. If I get the structure right, then it's an easy process. Where then I'm just, spending maybe 3 to 6 more months revising it after getting notes from my editor and agent. There are books that I did not get the structure right the first time. The Last House Guest is one of them. That took me an extra year than I thought it would. I wrote it 3 or 4 complete different times in complete different ways. Before, like I started it at 2 points of view, if anyone's read it. Then I wrote it as 3 points of view. The finished version is 1 point of view with 2 timelines, and it's thinking about what's the heart of the story, what am I trying to reveal, and why. So I can never say for sure, like 9 months and we're good. So what I try to do now, and I've worked with my editor for a long time, which she's wonderful and knows my writing process too, and so I usually send about 50 pages so that there's a feel of the structure. Like, do we think this is doing what I hope it's doing? And then if we're all in agreement that it is, then it's a smooth process of hopefully 9 months.
I love books from different point of views. I always wondered, like, is it really difficult to write from different point of views, or like, do you prefer one and then multiple?
Yeah, I'm actually drawn usually to one point of view because I write from first character, and so I like to be like, and because I don't know what's going on when I start, I can inhabit this character who also doesn't know and is suspicious of everyone and trying to figure out what's going on and who to trust and why. And I feel like I can connect to their emotion of uncertainty. Like I've luckily never had anything dramatic like this happen in my past, but I can connect to the emotions related to all these characters in different, smaller ways. And I feel like that's what allows me to write them. This was my first, one of my YAs was dual points of view, Come Find Me. This was the first where I wrote from like 7 characters, and I only did one of them first person. So Cassidy is the one who tells the story in the present, and that's how I usually write a book, like just from her perspective. And the flashbacks, even though they focus on each separate character, are third person. And that was my way of being able to still stay in one character's headspace, because I think it's hard to inhabit several headspaces and capture that voice. And I love reading stories that way. And I've heard different authors talk about how they just will write like one of the characters at a time sometimes to keep that in their mind. But I have to kind of write a story in the order that it's read in order to like capture all the elements that I'm shooting for. It's just my process. So this was the way that worked for me. I think it is harder probably to write for multiple. But I really enjoy like following one character and figuring out like what are the things she isn't seeing, and you may never see them, which I think is one of the beauties of having multiple characters, is you get to see things that the other characters aren't. But that was kind of fun in the past of getting to do that, seeing the different perspectives.
Last questions.
We may have some from the audience. Jacob, do you want to, or is it just comments? Sometimes, I'm not very good at reading the Facebook thing, so it's hard to tell. I have something, pardon me, while I prepare up in the front. So weirdly, this morning, as I heard was an opportunity to try to catch up on books, I read a new book called The House is on Fire by Rachel Beeman. And it's rooted in the Richmond theater fighter of 1811. And the scenario is basically exactly the same one that Megan has in this book. If you have a whole bunch of people in a theater that's burning, the same questions arise. If you're one of those people, do you try to save yourself? Do you try to save other people? What are the consequences of trying to save people? What are the consequences of not? And I was just amazed, because of course I just read your book in order to do this, to read them back to back and recognize that that situation has arisen time and time again, 1811 in the present. This is a fabulous book, The House is on Fire. I really recommend it to you, especially if you read this book and you begin to ask yourself that key question, what would you do? This is another book to follow through. And occasionally, no matter how tragic things are, somebody, in a way, either benefits or their life is transformed. We saw that after 9/11. There were a couple of stories like this. And there is one character in this book, a slave, and she has, I won't go into whatever, but anyway, she's been subjected to really horrible things, and it appears that she died in the fire. She didn't, which gives her a chance to reboot her life, as we would say today. In those days, it gave her a chance to run away or to disappear, but she had to have help to do it. So while the fire was tragic for everybody but Cecily, for Cecily it actually was a chance to have a life that would never have come to her without her having been present with her mistress in the theater that night. And I think, it's important to recognize that all events, have different consequences for different people. And while it might mostly be tragic, occasionally it turns out to be beneficial if you didn't die. That's what you have to survive it in order for it to be beneficial. But it was very odd to read this book this morning. And I'm sorry that I could read a book or even 2 books in the morning before I could read it. No, until I became a bookseller, I never had enough books. So, right, it's really annoying. Other people have perfect pitch. There are people who are great gymnasts and all. For absolutely no reason that I'm aware of, I came with an ability to speak free. It's just one of those things that, but it's a useful skill. Or it used to be a curse because I never had enough books. So there we are. Is there a final question? Anybody has? Yes, sir.
Was there any character that you wrote that surprised you that it turned out differently than you originally thought?
Great question.
Yeah, it is great. And yes, there are several characters actually that surprised me when I was writing this, because when you do see, like you were saying, these things that happen in the past and you realize the decisions they make, it sometimes took them in directions I wasn't expecting them to go afterwards, and make them, some characters became more of a risk taker after, because to them the worst thing already happened to them. And I hadn't considered that until I wrote that character's point of view, and now they're fearless, can make decisions on the fly. And so I did learn a lot about each character differently once I went back into those back chapters.
So the final question, the one we usually end up with is, what are you working on? What is the next April book as you actually make your deadline?
Yes.
Right. What is it
So-
likely to be?
Well, it is likely to be set in a lake in the mountains. And like a lot of my books, it is a small town community where a lot of people have a long history with one another. I don't want to say too much about the plot yet because they sometimes change a lot in revisions, but it is maybe structured and focused more on a family unit than a group of, old friends.
Now, as long as it engages your interest,
Yeah.
because after all, she's bored, you're going to be reading it. She publishes it. So we have a general attempt at every event to give away an advanced reading copy to familiarize you with an author that you might never have read. This is an older book, which I plucked from the archives of the Poison Pen, but nonetheless, it's a lot of fun. And did we do numbers today?
Yeah.
We did. We don't have any idea how many there were, though, do we? No.
Tickets?
Yeah. I know, but if you tell us that.
No, I won't.
Well,
Well, there'd be more than me. I'd say no more than 20.
Okay, well, if I'm going to pick a number, I'm going to do it. I feel like this book is 7 days in the present, 7 hours in the past, 7 survivors remaining. We're going with number 7.
Oh, look, there's a
You would be the one that